No one dared defy him. His name hung over the city like winter, crisp, unquestioned, dangerous in its stillness. Where Li Jingchuan walked, conversations dimmed, smiles sharpened into practiced respect. He moved through the Gala as if the marble beneath his shoes had been laid down for him alone, every step precise, every look measured. Men watched his face the way fishermen watch the sea before a storm. Women arranged their dresses so that, if his gaze landed on them, the world would look right. He spoke in few words. Those words landed like frost. Shen Nanxi had mud on her boots. She did not belong in the list of chandeliers and lacquered names. She belonged to a room above a narrow alley, where steam rose from a pot of decoction and a sign made of faded wood hung crookedly over a door. Nanxi's clinic, open nights. Her hands still smelled of herbs. Her coat still carried the dust of the country road that morning. Someone had slipped her an invitation, left over through a cousin who worked in the catering. She had come because everyone she knew wanted to see what the richest people looked like up close, because curiosity is a kind of courage, and because when you grow accustomed to being pushed aside, you learn to push back in small ways. They did not push back at the Li family. The gala was a scene the city wrote about in headlines. A charity fundraiser presented as a pageant of perfect lives. Cameras made constellations out of flashbulbs. The guest list read like a ledger of influence. Li Jingchuan, the head of the Jingchuan group, sat at the center of it, a statue made of tailored suit and contained silence, flanked by board members and socialites. At his left, Qiao Jingjing laughed like a polished bell, her smile a practiced curve designed to glitter in photographs. She was the sort of woman whose elegance had been purchased in exact sums. She smelled faintly of jasmine and grievance. Nanxi drifted through the edges of the room like a moth skimming a chandelier. Eyes slid off her. Some offered mercy in the form of a quiet apology. Others offered the cruelty of clear judgment. At the buffet, a woman whose dress cost more than Nanxi's entire month pushed her elbow into Nanxi's ribs while scooping smoked salmon, and a man behind the bar, drunk on his own importance, snorted as if she were a joke. Nanxi kept pace with politeness. She smiled with the patience of someone used to smoothing rough edges. It was a child, no more than 7, who upset the arrangement of the evening. The little boy wandered away from his mother through a maze of silk and perfume and tripped on an unseen step. He fell into the display of crystal glasses. A fracture of noise, glasses scattering like stars falling, sliced the cultivated hush. The room flinched. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone laughed, cruel and brittle, because it was easier to laugh than to help. Nanxi did not laugh. She cupped the boy's cheek with keen, sure hands and shepherded him to a corner, brushing his chin with the corner of a napkin. The boy's lip bled. An older woman, his mother, flushed with embarrassment and disdain, whispering angry things about accidents and the cost of ruined glass. Nanxi's fingers smelled of iodine and herb. She pressed a cooling cloth to the boy's lip and told him, softly, to breathe. That was when the woman who had pushed her scoffed and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Is this the sort of company your kind keeps? Dirt and silk, how quaint." The room's laughter orbited back to Nanxi like a ring of cold. Someone's phone lifted. A camera's eye found her and the boy, caught in a composure that made a better headline than the charity itself. She straightened, cheeks flushing, a momentary flare of raw pride. "He's my boyfriend," she said. It escaped her, sharp, absurd, immediate. It was a line that belonged in a storybook, not a hall of power. But the room took it in as if it had been a proclamation. The words landed like a pebble in a still pond. Ripples uncoiled across crystal and silk and smug faces. For a breath, the air changed its tune. Someone laughed at first, shock with a wedge of cruelty. Then the laughter tightened. Cameras swung. Qiao Jingjing's smile sharpened into something colder. A dozen mouths opened and closed in patterns of calculated outrage. The social engines chugged to life. Rumors, whispers, the quick dispatch of insult dressed as concern. Li Jingchuan looked at her. He did not laugh. He did not look amused or pleased. He simply turned his face, as one turns the page of a ledger, clearly noting the anomaly that had disturbed his evening. His eyes were the color of winter river water, fast and secretive. The look he gave her was not curiosity, it was appraisal. He measured the audacity in her tone, and it made him briefly, almost imperceptibly irritated. His irritation felt like a challenge to those who adored him. Who was this woman who dared to mislabel him in public? Nanxi felt something like panic and something like defiance braid together. She had bluffed, the way a traveler bluffs when asked the price of passage and only a scarred coin jingles in her pocket. She had thought to slip out, to let the story evaporate. She did not expect the sea of faces to rearrange itself around that one word. In the corner, a photographer captured the moment, her declaration and his cold countenance. The flash froze everything. The photograph ran the next morning across social feeds and gossip columns. Headlines stoked like fire. Scandal tonight? Rich bachelor and unknown woman? The outrage came off like a wind of small stones. Qiao Jingjing's social circle tutted. A dozen commentators offered theories. There was, in short order, no such thing as anonymity for either of them. For Li Jingchuan, whose life was a carefully maintained architecture of privacy and prestige, a rumor, no matter how absurd, was a fissure. For Shen Nanxi, a photograph could mean the end of a little clinic that lived by reputation and trust among a community that believed in discretion. She had not come to be a headline. She had come for a look. She had left with consequences. Later that night, as the gala wound down and the city swallowed the last of its glitter, the Li family's private suite hummed with a different kind of breath. Lantern light or hospital fluorescence could both be cruel. Grandma Li had attended the gala for decades, a living portrait of the family's continuity. Small, fierce, with eyes that had seen betrayals and victories in equal measure. During the dinner, she had been stubbornly polite, making her way through small talk the way someone threads beads on a string. But then, sudden, to everyone who loved to imagine the future and control it, she had folded her hand over her heart and exhaled as if the room had tightened. She was taken to the hospital in a flurry of whispered commands, doctors' shoes gliding over polished floors. In the waiting room, Li Jingchuan's expression folded into something else entirely. Not calculation exactly, but worry that cut at his usual reserve. He sat with hands clasped. For people who had everything, the one thing they could not buy was certainty of health. By dawn, Grandma Li's condition was fragile. The chief physician spoke in measured tones about a condition that, in the cold ledger of hospital rooms, required immediate attention and the right kind of hands. A name surfaced among them, the night doctor, a reputed healer known for unconventional methods and quiet miracles. The night doctor existed at the edge of rumor, the kind of legend people circulated when they wanted comfort under impossible bets. The board of the foundation sniffed at such ideas. They preferred white coats with institutional affiliations, not myths. Someone in the family committee remembered the photograph. The idea of the heir pictured with a woman from the wrong side of town was a scandal waiting to be weaponized. Qiao Jingjing's allies could exploit it to tighten her position. Shareholders could use it to question Li Jingchuan's judgment. The family council, in the cool logic of their inheritance, decided they needed a solution that would stop gossip and soothe the matriarch. Arrange for a temporary arrangement, a spouse in name that would be a public bomb, not a real tie. It was a pragmatic solution to a public relations emergency. Li Jingchuan, bound to a family that loved continuity more than tenderness, listened as they mapped the plan. For Li Jingchuan, the plan should have been contemptible. He had spent a life avoiding being used as a prop. He had refused many marriages arranged for political gain because they blurred the line between what he wanted and what he would be forced to represent. But the sight of his grandmother, frayed but not yet gone, insisting in small stubborn ways on the life she wanted to see, affected him in a place no contract had touched. Nanxi went to the hospital because she could not do otherwise. When she saw the woman who had once smiled at her from family portraits lying pale and small in a bed, the carnival of social ranks outside the window felt obscene. Nanxi had, in another life, tended to people who could not afford the city's long list of specialists. She had learned to treat cuts and fevers with precise hands and a mind trained by necessity. Her knowledge had always been practical and sometimes brilliant in ways meant for rooms with no cameras. She knew how to quiet someone's breath with a particular poultice, how to catch a fever before it became a fire. The night doctor was a myth. Her hands were not. The hospital would not allow her in without credentials. Logics and policies brushed against practical need. A nurse, exhausted and rigid, barred her way. Nanxi did not argue with the kind of force that came from titles. She argued with truth. She had been with Grandma the night before. She knew what soothed an old woman's cough. She could be useful on the margin where machines cannot reach. Li Jingchuan saw her in the hallway then, her coat still streaked with the night's dust, hands raw from tending, eyes steady and strange. He had, for all his caution, a view of the world that allowed him to see usefulness when it blinked at him. He could have shut the door, asked the guards to erase the offending photograph from memory. Instead, he opened it. "Do you know the night doctor?" he asked, because sometimes the cold have ways of thawing into decisive action. "I know hands," Nanxi said. "I know how to keep a fever from going wild, that's all." She was not one to call her skills miraculous. She called them necessary. Inside the small curtained space near Grandma Li's bed, Nanxi worked with the economy of someone who had no room for theatrics. She applied a compress, spoke quietly, asked the woman questions in a voice made for waiting rooms and midnight alleys. It was not a miracle. It was a series of right moves strung together by someone who had watched sickness and stitched it back through nights of long practice. Grandma's breathing eased as if a stitch had been loosened. Eyes that had ruled a city blinked and became suddenly childlike. For a few moments, the hospital room held a fragile peace. News travels differently when it carries an image of something everyone secretly wanted to believe. The headline of the day shifted. The scandal of the photograph receded beneath another story, an unnamed woman who had helped Grandma Li through a night of crisis. The family noticed. The board watched as speculation tilted to a different angle. Perhaps a temporary marriage would calm their matriarch. The rumor of the night doctor swirled. Someone whispered that a name had been given, but no credentials could be produced. Li Jingchuan's solution was born out of this pressure more than out of warmth. He proposed a contract. It was the language of his life, precise, limited, enforceable. The clause would be short and to the point. A marriage in name and presentation for a fixed period to placate a fragile old woman and settle the city's gossip that threatened to become pernicious. No transfer of estate, no emotional insistence. A practical arrangement between two people with different currencies. When he asked Nanxi, he expected a rebuff or a laugh. He expected resistance. She surprised him. "You want me to sign my name and sit under your roof," Nanxi said. She did not soften the words. "Why would I do that?" "Because you want your clinic to survive," he said. "Because you walked into my family suite and told everyone what you wanted to be true. Because my grandmother is sleeping better this morning than the doctors expected, and she asked to see me married. Because you help her. Because the photograph will ruin whatever privacy you have left." His voice was smooth, an even frost. It carried a hand offered as if it were a business card, pragmatic, stripped of sentiment. Nanxi folded her arms as if the idea itself were as cold as marble. She kept thinking of the nights she had spent watching patients through fever, her clinic barely paying for heat. She thought of the ledger she kept in a small book, of the names she could not call without lowering her eyes. She thought of the boy at the gala whose lips she had pressed with a napkin, and how quickly the world reduced him to spectacle. She saw in this contract a way to shelter the things that mattered, her patience, her dignity, the quiet work that fed her. She also saw an unlit risk, becoming a pawn. She did not like being a pawn, but she had other weapons, clear speech, steady hands, and an offer to set terms. "Then I sign a contract," she said finally, and surprised herself by the clarity of the conditions she proposed. 1 year, no pretenses outside agreed events. I keep my clinic. You let me visit your grandmother. No interference in treatment decisions when I'm asked. If anyone slanders me publicly, you, your family, shall correct it. Payment up front for the arrangement, and a clause that allows me to leave if my safety or professional reputation is compromised. He did not blink at the list. He had rarely met someone so direct. It disarmed him the way a punch disarms a pious sermon, unexpected and immediately useful. He had sleight-of-hand methods to get what he wanted. He also respected someone who named their needs plainly. A contract, then. Signatures inked in an office of legal minds who framed the arrangement as a clean remedy to a potential public relations wound. The paper smelled like a compromise. For Li Jingchuan, it was a solution that placed his duty to family above the messy tangles of personal connection. For Nanxi, it was a shelter, temporary and stern, within which she could protect the fragile things that mattered to her. Word of the contract spread faster than the Gala rumor. It became, for a night, the city's favorite conversation. The rich passed it as strategy, the poor passed it as spectacle, and the gossipers passed it as hope. Nanxi felt attention teeth into her. She felt eyes follow her as if she had become a public good to be dissected. And yet, in the heart of that pressure, something else stirred, unexpected and unwelcome, a protective sensation blooming across a place she had never thought to name. Jingchuan remained outwardly unchanged. He moved with the familiar economy of silence, but there were small fissures, a hand that stayed a beat longer when reaching for a blanket, a message that read like a directive, a late payment to the clinic with no note attached. He bought, without fanfare, a new boiler for the alley behind Nanxi's clinic and arranged an untraceable transfer that ensured a supplier would not threaten her supplies. He did not tell her. He could have spun that into a story of generosity and control, but he chose instead the quiet of a repaired furnace. His gifts were not public, they were logistical, the sort of aid that read like attention without adornment. The household adjusted to the contract with the glacial speed of institutions learning to accept a new fixture. The mansion's staff catalogued her as Mrs. Li for the calendar and Ms. Shen for the rest of their private conversations. The maids watched her hands and wondered what secrets they could not see. Qiao Jingjing, whose designs on the air had been interrupted by the photograph and the contract, watched in a way that left no room for kindness. She was venom in a silk dress. If Nanxi's presence was an irritation, she intended to make it a lasting wound. They made rules for Nanxi's presence, appearances at certain charity events, a carefully curated dinner with the board, photos in approved frames. The contract was a series of obligations designed to maintain balance, obligations that were, at least on paper, fair. But fairness and dignity rarely live in the same room when wealth listens to its own echo. Nanxi moved into a smaller suite within the mansion at the agreed hour. Her trunk smelled faintly of boiled herbs. She placed her teapot on the little table the house staff provided and wrote the name of her clinic on a slip of paper, tucking it into the pocket of a dress she had chosen that morning in a room of old mirrors. The rooms were cold in a way the clinic never was. The air smelled of lemon disinfectant and the faint metallic tang of money. She missed the kettle's perpetual whine in the alley, the way the building's lights blinked off at dawn. In the quiet hours, she unconsciously searched for an answer to a question she had not been brave enough to name. How much of herself would she trade to protect what she loved? The first day at the mansion was a lesson in being watched. The staff extended a carefully neutral hospitality. The housekeeper, however, could not hide her contempt. She placed a kettle on Nanxi's burner, and then asked too loudly, "Do you know which cutlery is for the guests?" Nanxi did. She smiled in a way that was both rueful and unruffled. She had learned to hold the sort of quiet dignity that could not be bought with the clink of silver. She answered without apology. "I do," she said, and showed the woman how she preferred her tea. It was a small victory. It was the sort of moment that mattered more than elaborate declarations. Qiao Jingjing moved through the mansion like a storm in a teacup, bright, polished, and full of venom. She greeted Nanxi with a smile that suggested either pity or pleasure in the consumption of someone else's discomfort. Then she did something that revealed cruelty wearing the same face as civility. She arranged a luncheon under the pretense of welcoming the new Mrs. Li and invited only women who believed in keeping their rank. The luncheon was a display. It was a performance in which Nanxi's clothes and manner would be judged and found wanting. The women sipped chamomile and traded stories shaped to make her feel small. They asked questions about upbringing and schooling and left an air of condescension in the steam above their cups. Nanxi answered every question with calm, as if she were tending to a fever. She spoke of patience rather than pedigree. She said things about healing that made the room grow colder. "People are built of the same parts," she said. "You can't measure compassion by a dress code." The ladies made polite noises that meant nothing and left with a fresh store of gossip. Nanxi sat alone for a moment, feeling the weight of eyes like a pressure she could not easily bear. She had, at least on paper, achieved a strange kind of safety. She had also put herself inside a glass house. And yet, when the house settled in the evenings, some of her small acts of care reached farther than she expected. The grandmother in the third-floor wing, Mrs. Hu, a retired seamstress who mended socialites' gowns, suddenly needed the sort of attention Nanxi knew how to give. Nanxi brought herbal compresses and patience, and Mrs. Hughes' breathing eased. Not all victories were loud. Some were soft, and for Nanxi, that softness counted as proof the contract might be used for a life other than spectacle. In those hours, Li Jingchuan watched her from the distance that had become his habit. He observed the way she moved through rooms, the way she treated a withered hand as if it were as valuable as a ledger. He caught once a glimmer of something like admiration, and then dismissed it as improper. He had not planned to let admiration in. His etiquette was honed to keep attachments tidy and manageable. Yet there were moments when the cold around him thinned, when he overheard her humming under her breath while folding towels, or when he found, inexplicably, that he had left a payment at her clinic in cash with an anonymous note. The gestures were irregular, like the first cracks appearing in winter's ice. Nanxi, for her part, did not mistake these small mercies for love. She treated them as necessary kindnesses wrapped in mystery. She preferred to think in terms of survival. She measured his gestures by the help they afforded to others. If a transfer to pay a supplier allowed her clinic to keep running through the winter, she would accept it with a stiff nod and no inquiry. She had learned not to pry into pockets she did not depend on. Outside the mansion, the city continued to reinvent the story for itself. The commentariat invented motives. The shareholders played their games in boardrooms. Qiao Jingjing's circle, affronted at the loss of a presumed prize, began to conspire. She could not stand the idea that someone of no pedigree had placed herself inside the family's orbit. It was an affront. From that sense of injury, schemes grew like mold. At the clinic, meanwhile, Nanxi continued her quiet nights. She kept a late schedule because the people who needed her most could not afford daytime appointments. The clinic's sign flickered in the rain sometimes. Inside, wooden shelves held jars of dried roots and loose tea. A small lamp was always on, as if to mimic a hearth. Patients came in with coughs and worries, broken hands and desperate hope. Nanxi listened and treated, and in her hands, the city's small aches found attention. One night, a man came in with a complaint that was beyond a simple bandage. He was a low-level employee for a factory on the outskirts, and he had a growth on his arm that had worsened over months, a lump that frightened his wife and embarrassed his boss. He had been told by a hospital that the only option was surgery and a long convalescence he could not afford. Nanxi examined the man and found the mass to be problematic but manageable with careful staged treatment. Treatment that would not cure everything but might buy time. She taught the man how to care for the wound, how to reduce inflammation with poultices and rest, how to avoid infection. She prescribed a regimen that was plausible within the fiction of the story. Time, attention, and a new bandaging technique that kept the wound cleaner. The man left with a list and a small pocket of hope. That night, Nanxi documented the case in shorthand at the back of her ledger, not as a triumph, but as a method to be improved, an experiment in compassion. Her hands were clever. Those who came to her whispered about the girl who healed. The rumor spread like the echo in a small room. It reached ears that sometimes belonged to men in suits with research grants and to the gossip mongers who enjoyed naming every myth. One morning, as the first half of their contract unfolded and the mansion still arranged itself around the new occupant, Li Jingchuan received an envelope from someone who signed only as a friend of medicine. Inside was a single sheet, a note that mentioned a surgeon named Li Yunfeng, a prodigy in the medical community who had recently written an article about a novel device that reduced tumor size in experimental trials. The note suggested there was merit in conversations between noteworthy practitioners. Li Jingchuan read it and did nothing. He had many notes in his life. Yet the mention of a device and the word experiment tugged at something he had an odd relation to, the idea that wealth could seed invention that helped rather than consumed. He had, in a manner of speaking, been born to protect things. The company he ran held investments like a city holds its arteries, through boards and council. He believed in strategy. He also had a grandmother who wanted to see a life laid out in a manner that soothed her. The contract was for him a temporary mechanism to smooth out the present while the future was considered. But the future did not wait politely. Rumors about a night doctor reached ears beyond gossip columns. A rival, someone annoyed at Qiao Jingjing's sudden absence from the heir's immediate orbit, attempted to parlay the photograph into a scandal that would pressure Li Jingchuan into a more public stake, a marriage that served alliances. It was a crude calculation, Associate the heir with someone disreputable? Watch the market react? Buy up shares on the cheap? The sort of petty cruelty that wore suits. Nanxi found out about the market's interest the afternoon she received a message demanding she stop treating an old woman who had been a donor to the foundation. The message arrived from an anonymous account with an official-sounding email. It threatened public exposure if she did not cease her involvement. Nanxi read it and felt the old heat of righteous anger. She had no time for threats. She was not naive enough to think the world was fair, but she was stubborn enough to think someone should do the right thing. She replied, not by legal counsel, she had none, but by action. She went to the hospital to see Grandma Li and asked the woman, who had grown fond of her, if she needed anything else. Grandma Li, who had been stern and controlling for so many years, smiled a small, private smile at Nanxi, as if they had shared a secret. "You are sincere," she said, with the ease of someone speaking at last. "You kept my night easy." Sincerity, in the Li household, was a rare currency. When Chao Jingjing learned that Nanxi refused to be cowed, she escalated. She began to spread rumors of a fake night doctor, an imposter who used cleverness to step into a role she did not earn. She commissioned an actress, someone who could mimic bedside manner, and arranged for a staged interview that suggested the poor girl had only learned a trick or two, that any real physician would laugh at the idea she had pretended. The press loved a scandal. Social media fed it. For every person Nanxi helped, 10 people were willing to believe the worst, but the world has a way of balancing rumor with need. When the scandal reached the edges of the company's research board, Li Yunfeng, the young surgeon whose work had been mentioned in the anonymous note, stepped into view, curious and precise. He was a man of science, not scandal. He read the articles and smelled the faintly sour stench of rumor. He decided to see, with an exacting curiosity, who the person behind the rumor was. Meeting Nanxi was not at all what he expected. He found a woman with a small clinic that smelled of tea and the damp earth of the countryside. He found a patient ledger that read more carefully than many case notes he'd seen in glossy journals. He watched her tie a bandage with practiced fingers and ask questions that would have taken years in a classroom to learn. She had, in other words, the apprenticeship of necessity, a deep pragmatic knowledge braided with intuition and stubborn respect for the human body as more than a machine. Li Yunfeng did not then dismiss her. He asked the right questions, and she answered them with a combination of precise jargon and clear common sense. Something in his careful demeanor brightened. He saw, beneath the humble treatment, a mind that understood patterns. He asked about her methods not to prove her a fraud, but to map her competence. He took notes, polite and professional, as if he had stumbled upon a new specimen of knowledge. He did not publish a rebuke or a correction, he simply kept watching. He visited the clinic a few times, formally enough to be above suspicion, and each time he left, more convinced that behind the rumor was a woman who had earned the skill she possessed. The night doctor myth, he decided, might be a cloak for someone who preferred not to be known, or it might be a persona she'd worn once to save a life. Either way, he thought, here was a person worth attention. The first part of their strange, slow story closed in on the edge of a new danger. Xiao Jingjing would not stop. The board's patience thinned when headlines threatened their share prices. Nanxi's clinic might be exposed or shuttered. And Li Jingchuan's calm calculation was beginning to be punctured by small acts that did not belong to his vocabulary. The contract was a shelter, but shelters must be defended. Nanxi stood in the mansion's high balcony one evening, watching the city sprawl like a map laid out in lights. Her breath clouded the glass. Down below, life moved on, some people eating quietly, others battling markets. She had not wanted this life, not its spectacle, and yet she had stepped into it with open eyes. She had made bargains that kept her hands free to heal. She had agreed to live under a roof that smelled of lemon and money, because sometimes dignity looked like a temporary accommodation. Far below, in a room of his own, Li Jingchuan reviewed the company's morning reports. The numbers crawled across the screen like indifferent insects. He should have felt nothing. Instead, a message rested in his inbox from someone who had always preferred to keep their distance. A note from the hospital chief thanking him for facilitating the care that had eased his grandmother's night. It was small gratitude. It was also a stitch. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Li found himself who he had been, frost-bound and absolute, acquainting itself with the idea of being needed for reasons other than power. And the city, hungry for entertainment, scandal, and redemption, waited with that peculiar appetite only public life could incite. Who was the woman who dared? Would she become the scapegoat Qiao Jingjing hoped for? Or would she prove the quiet, steady type of person who bends a narrative on its hinge? If this twist has grabbed your attention, stay with it. Keep watching to see whether truth or titles win as one small lie turns into the city's quietest revolution. The first days of living under contract were a lesson in compromise. Nanxi insisted on daily boundaries. She would not attend frivolous galas except the ones that concerned the foundation. She would keep certain nights for her clinic. She would expect clear, documented redress against slanders. Li Jingchuan consented in gestures that were both corporate and personal. He had the contract amended to include confidentiality clauses that protected her patients' identities. He approved funds to patch the clinic's leaking roof. He signed in ink that did not imply warmth. Domestic life in the mansion moved with a choreography that had little to do with romance. It was awkward at first. Meals were eaten with formal distances, the sort that exist between strangers who are bound by civic convenience rather than affection. Nanxi learned which cutlery to use without a biting slew of correction, and Li learned how to find her in the mansion if needed, what wing she preferred when she chose to read, what book she liked on nights when she could not sleep. He catalogued these details the same way one catalogues assets. Sometimes knowledge is neutral until someone arms it with meaning. An incident occurred that could have undone them both within a week. An afternoon courier from a gossip site arrived at the clinic. A letter, thin, yellowing with the cheapness of a scandal, had found its way into Nanxi's locked drawer. It alleged that the night doctor was a fraud. It contained photographs of a staged interview and an accusation crafted to humiliate. Someone had paid handsomely to make it look true. Anger burned like a fever in Nanxi's chest. She could have run, retreated to the narrow shelter of her life, or she could stand and show the world, one patient at a time, that the accusers were full of air. She chose the latter. She did not deny every slur in public. She kept a ledger and a modest plan. She would need more than moral outrage to withstand a campaign. She needed validation that could not be bought with money or the clangor of social prestige. The board, meanwhile, convened and spat the rumor into the blue light of strategy. Qiao Jingjing's camp demanded that Li make a public statement to distance himself in the interest of shareholders. Li Jingchuan listened. He felt annoyance at the audacity of being told how to behave, and he felt annoyance at the audacity of being told how to behave, and a new private tension that tugged at something he had long kept sealed, the sense of responsibility that was not only a ledger entry, but a stitch in a life. The board's calls multiplied, the rumor mill spun faster. Analysts recommended distance. Socialites whispered that the heir must act like an heir and not like a philanthropist with a soft spot for melodrama. Li Jingchuan listened to the council and found their voices like a tide he could not always command. Yet behind those voices, in a place he rarely named, something that resembled care had settled and would not be shushed. Qiao Jingjing, sensing weakness as predators sense blood, doubled down. She was not subtle. She hired an actress to perform the bedside manner of the night doctor and arranged clandestine interviews with influencers who loved scandal enough to sell it. The fabricated footage hit socials like a storm surge. Comments piled up, algorithms amplified, and the narrative became more cruel than it had been kind. The smear said Nanxi was a charlatan. It said the night doctor was a costume donned for sympathy. It said the photograph had been staged all along to dupe the Li family. Nanxi read the headlines in the clinic between patients. She closed the newspaper slowly like a book that had a brutal, inaccurate ending. Rage flared, then cooled into the pragmatic determination that had always been her first tool. She would not scream. She would not beg. She would demonstrate, quietly and repeatedly, that she was not what those camera angles claimed. Li Yunfeng, meanwhile, did what scientists sometimes do when the noise around a phenomenon grows too loud. He came to see it with his own eyes. He came first as curiosity, and then as a calibrating force. He arrived at the clinic with a calm that was all surgical training. Steady hands are born of a mind that refuses surprises, and he watched Nanxi as she worked. He sat in the small treatment room, heartbeats of the city leaking through the thin walls, and observed her ask questions that betrayed a practiced mind. About onset, about progression, about systemic responses. He saw her treat a persistent infection with a measured regimen that bought time and dignity. He noticed the notebook of follow-ups stitched in tidy ink. When the staged interview footage surfaced, he did not tweet indignant corrections. He wrote a letter, concise, professional, and requested a formal meeting with Nanxi, and, later, an invitation to the hospital where the device he'd read about had been prototyped. He was a man who believed in evidence, and evidence to him meant observation and reproducibility. In his own understated way, he became an instrument for the only remedy that would matter in the long run: proof. The city continued to churn with speculation until something undeniably urgent redirected attention. Shen Nanxi, Nanxi's younger sister by the same father's line but different childhoods, collapsed at her workplace 2 weeks after the smear reached its fever pitch. Yi had been the one to leave town years ago with bitterness, jealousies of Nanxi's stubborn competence, the old family slights, the quiet grudges that harden into habits. She had married into a house that admired outward perfection. She had learned painfully how fragile that perfection could be. Her collapse led to scans and a diagnosis that, in the world of the story, read as a dire but operable threat. A mass had been found deep enough to require more than a bandage and less than certain tragedy. The surgeons said it demanded a combination of thoughtful resection and a device that promised to reduce the mass before an invasive incision. That same experimental device Li Yunfeng had discussed. A hospital board meeting followed. Clinicians debated the ethics of attempting a new method where tried and true had limited chances. For Nanxi, the news landed like a stone thrown into water. She had not been on close terms with Yi. She carried instead a burden of complicated memories, humiliations, and small acts of resistance. But family, when it breaks, often leaves one with threads that do not snap cleanly. Seeing Yi in a hospital bed with the hollow look of someone who had nothing left but fear forced Nanxi to choose between bitterness and the one thing she had always held to be non-negotiable: care. She did not ask permission to be present, she asked to be useful. The hospital's legal machinery balked, credentials were required, and the smear made the administration skittish. Li Yunfeng, who had by then seen enough of Nanxi's work to trust its essence, intervened. He argued for her role not as a headline, but as a skilled assistant. Someone with intimate knowledge of the device's compatible adjunct therapies. Someone who had the practical insight to help the patient navigate recovery. His voice carried weight in that room where caution often masqueraded as moral superiority. Li Jingchuan heard about the meeting and chose, for once, not to stay removed. He walked into the hospital hallway and sat on the bench opposite the operating theater, palms folded, a man who was reserving courage as if it were a finite resource. He had not wanted to be pulled into personal defense. His career had been built on avoiding messy affections, but he understood, in a business sense and in a less comfortable personal sense, the stakes of allowing rumor to determine outcomes. If a life could be helped by a device that his company might supply, if a woman whose hands had eased his grandmother could be barred from contributing because of gossip, he would not stand aside. The board of the hospital wanted guarantees, the device vendors wanted more testing and less drama. Qiao Jingjing's network continued to whisper. Li Jingchuan opened his mouth where they expected silence. "If the medical team recommends it, they have our full backing," he said quietly to the hospital director, and the director, startled by the clarity of his stance, accepted. It was not a grand manifesto, it was a decisive allocation of trust and, implicitly, of resources. For him, that voice was the first public thaw, but he offered no speeches or romanticized pronouncements. Instead, he did what he knew. He moved power in the direction of protection. The operation was scheduled for a late afternoon when the winter light softened and the hospital's corridors smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Cameras lurked in the periphery, but the surgical theater remained a place of work, not performance. Li Yunfeng led a team that had rehearsed the mechanics for days. The device, an experimental instrument that, in this story's world, used a focused method to shrink certain cellular masses, sat sterile on a tray, its wires wrapped in sterile white like a sleeping animal. The team acknowledged the unknowns. They spoke little of miracles and much of contingency, backup plans, different approaches, and the human will to keep trying. Nanxi scrubbed next to them, not quite a peer by paper, but a peer by practice. In the sterile light she was both spectator and participant, a woman whose hands did not tremble in rooms where other people feared touching anything. They asked for her counsel on a particular herbal adjunct she had been refining, non-invasive, supportive, intended to calm inflammation. She provided it not as a magic bullet, but as a margin that might improve comfort and resilience. Li Yunfeng listened, took notes, and integrated her suggestion into the plan. It was the kind of collaboration that had no need of fanfare. It had only the simple, exacting hunger for anything that might tilt an outcome toward life. During the operation, a complication arose, not a sequence of steps, but the sudden human scramble that follows when a surgeon encounters a stubborn artery. There was a flurry of commands, a shift in lighting, a steadying breath that had to be taken in the sterile shout of a team. For a moment, it seemed the theater might fold under the weight of anxiety. Hands moved with trained calm. Li Yunfeng worked with focus that bordered on sacred. Nanxi stood just outside the direct line, her role advisory, her heart pounding in a rhythm she recognized from nights when a child's fever rose too high. She suggested an adjustment in patient positioning, something simple, nothing revelatory, grounded in a lifetime of practical problem-solving. It was the sort of contribution that, in a public relations war, would be easy to dismiss as chance. In the theater, it brought the surgeon a clearer angle and, importantly, time. Time mattered. The device performed within the fictional rules of the story. It reduced the mass enough that the resection that followed was less invasive, complications fewer. The operation ended with the hollow sound of exhausted laughter that only people who have almost lost something can make. The monitors steadied. The anesthesiologist let out a breath like a person who had been holding anger in their lungs for too long. Yi, still groggy in recovery, opened her eyes and found her sister's face bending toward her, hands rough from life and steady with tenderness. Outside the theater, Li Jingchuan sat in a waiting area that no camera had planned inside. He watched his phone without looking at it. He felt, in the slow pulse of relief, something thaw that had nothing to do with company maneuvering. It was private and terrible and beautiful. He had seen Nanxi's hands save, not perform miracles, but do the stubborn work that makes life possible. Guilt and admiration braided together like twin ribbons. He had done things for her that he had never announced. He had also withheld praise. The operation's success made praise possible without contradiction. The news of the operation's success could not be contained, nor should it have been. The hospital released a cautious statement about the collaborative effort between established surgeons and a practitioner whose skills contributed meaningfully to the outcome. Those who had spread the worst rumors found their voices muffled. Qiao Jingjing, unable to bear the tide turning, lashed out. She tried, in the graceless way of someone losing influence, to weaponize other secrets. Anonymous accusations, hints of impropriety, the predictable rearguard actions of a woman who only knew power when it reflected her image. What happened next was not instantaneous redemption, but the kind of vindication built from small, credible explosions of truth. Li Yunfeng published a short, measured paper, acknowledging the role an unusual adjunct had played in perioperative care, careful to avoid sensationalism while pointing to verifiable outcomes. His colleagues corroborated the basic facts. Journalists who had once fed on gossip now reported on a new angle, a competent healer whose practical methods deserved formal study. The actress Qiao had employed, pressed by conscience or a too-late pang of ethics, admitted before an investigator that she had been paid to perform and that her interviews had been staged. What followed was not a melodramatic takedown on the front page, but the quieter operation of consequence. Contracts dissolved, the charities committee moved to distance itself from scandal, and some socialites found their invitations rescinded in the slow bureaucratic manner that serves as public chastisement. Nanxi faced the exposure with a firmness that surprised even her. When asked about credentials, she did not claim titles she did not hold. She described, simply and precisely, what she knew. Long nights treating small-town ailments, the apprenticeship of listening, and the practical experiments that had taught her what had not been taught in lecture halls. She acknowledged that she had, once or twice, used the myth of the night doctor to get past a guard or into a room where a life dipped toward danger. She admitted, without theatrics, that she had done questionable things under duress, but had always prioritized the patient. That honesty undercut artful accusations. It showed a person whose methods could be examined and, if valid, integrated. The legal consequences of impersonation were acknowledged by the hospital in closed channels. An apology offered where apology was due, and a frank accounting that some of the decisions made in the name of urgency had been ethically fuzzy. Nanxi accepted criticism that was fair, and resisted smears that were surgical in their cruelty. Li Jingchuan's defense of her was the thing that finally made certain people stop trying to advise him on detachment. He did not march into a press room and declaim romantic tales. He did something sharper and more consequential. He went to the shareholders' meeting and put the company's weight behind the research program that would study the device and the adjunctive therapies Nanxi had used. He framed the move as a strategic investment in health innovation. He authorized funding for a proper lab and a formal partnership with the hospital. Then, and only then, he made a short statement in a curt tone that belonged to the man the city knew. "We will not allow reputation to be weaponized to harm patients. Our company will support the work that helps people." It was a public act with private motives. It threatened no one formally, but made clear where his priorities lay. For those who had tried to use rumor as leverage, the message was unmistakable. Their attempts would not rewrite results. The moment he stood to support her was a precise crack in the ice of his armor. He had risked shareholders' calm for a value that was not printed in quarterly reports. The gesture cost him currency in social circles. Qiao Jingjing's allies spun outrage, but it also bought something else no amount of money had previously purchased. The right to call Nanxi his, in a language that required no ceremony, an act of public protection that redefined his social capital as something that could be wielded to defend rather than to dominate. The fallout for Qiao Jingjing was complex, as human dramas often are. She lost influence more than status. Doors that had once opened with a flick now remained closed. Some of her allies apologized or simply disappeared. She retreated into a life that had fewer mirrors and more uncomfortable quiet. The narrative did not crucify her, it simply removed the stage she had used. There was, in that removal, a bitter lesson. Power used to harm often exhausts its own resources. In the quieter rooms after the turmoil, things mended in ways that felt more like sutures than fireworks. Nanxi and Yiye spent a night on opposite sides of a hospital couch, hands cold from machine hums, and tea turned to stone in a thermos. They did not speak of old insults at first. They spoke of petty human things. A recipe their mother once made, a ridiculous story about a neighbor. The small talk warmed into confessions. Yi, who had once worn anger like armor, apologized for cruelty she had allowed. She admitted to being scared, to resenting a sister who seemed to take up space with a dignity that did not require permission. Nanxi, who had no romantic illusions about sudden forgiveness, recognized the exhaustion beneath Yi's pride. They reconciled not with grand gestures, but with an exchange that resembled truce, a willingness to stop sabotaging each other, and an agreement to care in the ways they could. The family that had been a source of wound began, with small stubbornness, to become a source of repair. Grandma Li, who had been the axis of the original contract, observed the shifting landscape with the particular acuity of someone who had watched the same storms from different windows. She found herself approving in a quiet manner. She had wanted once to see her grandson secure within the rituals of status. What she had not expected was to see him choose protection over convenience. She called Nanxi into her private room one afternoon and, with a voice that had the fragile frankness of age, asked for a cup of tea. They sat together, two women who had inhabited different parts of one city, and had an honest conversation about fear and gratitude. Grandma Li's blessing was small. She would not erase the contract's legalities, but she would, with the stubbornness that had always been hers, insist on kindness being counted among the family's responsibilities. It was not the theatrical approval that social columns craved, it was something truer. As the research program took shape, Li Yunfeng became not only an ally but also a kind of professional bridge. He worked with Nanxi to formalize observations into reproducible protocols that respected ethical boundaries. They designed studies that would not promise miracles but would seek to test variables. Investors who had once sniffed at the project began to fund trials with a cautious optimism. The company's resources were deployed to build a lab that smelled of solvents and possibility instead of perfume and rumor. Nanxi, who had never wanted corporate praise, found herself in meetings where she spoke about patient dignity and the importance of measurable benefits. She carried the awkwardness of being invited into rooms she had never imagined, but met it with the same directness she used in small clinics. Speak plainly, guard what matters, and demand that ethics be more than a placard. The romance between her and Li Jingchuan did not leap into operatic confession. It was, instead, a steady narrowing of distance. He began to do things that could not be classified as purely logistical. He left her a copy of a book he knew she would like on a windowsill. He extended the courtesy of asking after a patient by name. He sat with her in a small tea room after an exhausting day of meetings and, for once, let his posture fall from precision into warmth. Nanxi noticed the little things, unpadded kindnesses, the careful way he stopped rehearsing his face into silence. She noticed them, catalogued them, and weighed them. Her heart, which had been trained to be cautious, did not fall at once, but it certainly leaned. One evening, months after the operation that had begun the public shift, Li Jingchuan found her standing at the clinic's back door, watching the rain bead on glass. The alley had been repaired, the boiler he'd arranged hummed without drama. He stood beside her and did not offer the corporate language he knew so well. He said simply, "You were right about the boy at the gala. You were right about the work." She glanced at him with her half-smile, the one that suggested the habit of keeping both hands on her life's tools. "I wasn't trying to be right," she said. "I wanted to keep people alive, if you must know." "That's the same thing sometimes," he answered. He did not offer gold, and she did not ask for it. He offered instead an admission that was quieter and harder. "You changed the way I keep watch." The winter that had once defined him as an atmosphere began to thaw in gestures that mattered. He answered her calls late at night, not with curt instructions, but with practical offers of help when her supplies ran low. He listened to stories of patience and did not patronize. He brought once a small box with a kettle inside it, an anonymous kind of gift that read like a conversation. Nanxi accepted him in the way she accepted many small offers, with guarded gratitude. Their intimacy deepened with a careful consent born of mutual reliance. There were nights when they bickered, when words landed like the sharp edges of unemployment notices. There were also nights when they shared silences in which the city's hum felt less like a roar and more like a background that allowed breath. He learned to ask questions that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with being known. She learned to ask for help in ways that were not framed as debts to be repaid. The contract, once a scaffold, became a strange relic of a time when necessity bound them together. It remained legally sound but emotionally redundant. The lab's first formal trial produced results that read as hopeful rather than miraculous. The device, combined with an adjunct therapy that respected patient variability, showed that for a subset of cases, outcomes improved measurably. Their findings were careful, peer-reviewed, and accompanied by admonitions against overgeneralization. In the story's world, this was enough. It turned whispers into a cautious kind of respect, and it began the hard work of making systems that had once excluded Nanxi's kind of knowledge pay attention. As their work found legitimacy, things in the personal sphere also sorted toward repair. Nanxi's parents, people who had been absent in complicated ways, came back into the picture with stuttering apologies and practical efforts to make amends. They had nothing dramatic to give that could reconstruct lost years, but they offered small material aid to the clinic and, more importantly, time. Nanxi received these gestures with a cautious heart and demanded not silence but accountability. Her father, who had once chosen social expediency over family, offered a brief, halting confession. He had left because he was afraid to fail at the life people expected of him and feared the small life of the clinic would bankrupt the family's name. It was the kind of confession that does not make wounds vanish but allows for a conversation in which someone else hears. Nanxi listened and set terms, practical, sensible, and unromantic. It was not victory, it was reconciliation by increments. Yi, who had been both victim and antagonist at different times, found steady work supporting clinical administration, not as penance but as a way to serve a sister who had once borne the brunt of their family's history. In a quiet scene, she and Nanxi sat cross-legged on the clinic floor and sorted through donated medical supplies, laughing at a bad brand of gauze. It was the kind of moment that novels sometimes try to invent and life sometimes gives. Small, domestic, and beyond headline value. Qiao Jingjing, removed from her pedestal, sent a single letter, an apology that read as much for the archive of her own conscience as for anyone else. Nanxi accepted it without malice, because forgiveness was, for her, often the pragmatic choice. It conserved energy for the living. The city had its appetite for drama, but the people who needed healing now had more air to breathe. Months passed, and the company's investment turned into a funded research program. The lab employed people who once sneered at Nanxi's alley, but now argued with her about controls and standard deviations. There was a strange, healthy arrogance in those debates. Two worlds converging with both skepticism and the hope that care could be improved by combining lived knowledge with scaled study. The public moment came at a modest conference where Li Yunfeng presented their preliminary results. Cameras were present, but not the gloating ones of earlier seasons. Li Jingchuan sat in the front row, his posture relaxed as if the armor he had worn for years could finally be set aside. Nanxi sat on the panel beside the surgeons, a woman whose hands had always been her certificate. She spoke plainly about limits and about the dignity of patients. The applause that followed was not a coronation, it was acknowledgement that a strange small justice had for once been served. After the conference, while the team celebrated in a low-key way, Li Jingchuan took Nanxi's hand in a small room that smelled of coffee and new paper. He did not produce a rehearsed speech. Instead, he said, in the unadorned voice that had always belonged to him, "No one dared defy me for the sake of spectacle. You did it because you could not let someone suffer needlessly. That," he paused, searching for a word he had not used in statements to shareholders, "that changed how I want to be." She watched him. There was an intimacy in the admission, an opening of a place that had been for power alone. It was not melodramatic, it was a literal thaw that read on his face. He had not promised a life of roses, but he had offered the more meaningful currency he had: presence. They did not rush the rest. They integrated private rituals, Sunday visits to the clinic with a thermos of tea, quiet dinners at home where they traded the day's annoyances for the warmth of someone who listened. Nanxi, who had never wanted to abandon her independence, agreed to make their future a negotiation with mutual respect rather than a transaction. He agreed to support the clinic and the research on terms she helped define. They moved their lives, slowly, into a new orbit. The story's final, small miracle came, not as a headline, but in the hush of an ordinary morning. Nanxi stood in the clinic's doorway with a test strip in her hand, a flutter of surprise in her chest that felt both dizzying and rooted. She had not told anyone she was trying. She had not planned anything but the small, honest life she had built. Li Jingchuan, who had learned how to listen to the uncommon things that mattered to her, entered the doorway without an announcement and saw her face. "What is it?" he asked, not a businessman now, but a man who held a tender private stake in small wonders. She held the strip up like a secret. "Looks like we're going to have a very small patient in the future," she said. Her voice was equal parts fear and hope. The two things fit together in a tight knot that people rarely let themselves own. He laughed then, not the sharp laugh of boardroom defense, but a deep, unguarded sound, and his laugh broke open the last of his frozen reserve into something sweetly human. He stepped forward and took her hand, an unmistakable, unbureaucratic touch. They told a few people in time. Grandma Li smiled with the half-ironical tenderness of someone who had seen the world tighten and loosen more times than was wise. Li Yunfeng sent a sardonic message about being added to the list of future godfathers. Yi Yi cried on a pretend shoulder and then promised to knit tiny sweaters. The city, which loved the drama of their early days, received the news with that peculiar blend of envy and relief. Here was a story of a cold man thawed and a healer who would pass on what she had learned. The end did not tidy every thread. Qiao Jingjing remained a figure reshaped by consequences and choice. The company continued to negotiate the tricky path between profit and humanity. Researchers kept testing with the sober pace of science. But there was, at the heart of it all, a core truth the title had announced and the story had labored to prove. No one had dared defy him in the way Nanxi did. She had stepped into a light that cut through frost, not by charm, but by steady competence and the kind of audacity that refuses to leave a person broken. In doing so, she had touched something within Li Jingchuan that was not a public image, but a private capacity to care. On a late spring afternoon, the couple walked across a park where green was a fresh, soft thing, and the city seemed less like a machine and more like a place where lives were made. She leaned his shoulder against a bench and looked at him, not at the air, not at the frost he had once been, but at the man who had learned, slowly and stubbornly, to be present. He reached for her hand and squeezed, an ordinary charged confirmation. They did not promise a life without struggle. They promised instead to keep tending what mattered, the clinic, the lab, a small person they both wanted to meet one day. It was not a fairy tale resolution. It was the steadier sort of ending stories that aim to reflect life sometimes have, imperfect people building a better later. If you felt this turn of heart and want more stories where stubborn kindness reshapes cold worlds, consider subscribing for the next chapter. There are other lives to tell, and the city always has room for one more quiet revolution.